Anybody who's been in any of these meetings that I've done knows I've had a mental block with recording. So sorry I missed the beginning of it, but the demo will be there, so that's the good part. Anyhow, uh, center myself again. So reference implementations. IMS makes a number of developer resources available to our community. And one thing that we've begun to add to that suite of resources in the recent years is reference implementations. I think the most the most common one that probably everybody knows about is the LTI reference implementation, which has been very successful in helping number of organizations get their LTI implementations off the ground. And just building off the feedback and the success that we had with that, we've come to the realization that these types of tools, these reference implementation tools, are really what developers want to see. They want to see how this plays out in practice, see examples of it, and see how they can get it to work on their own side. So, IMS is beginning to sort of get the reference implementation work to be a part of kind of our normal specification development process. And some of the newer projects that have been being worked on in the last few years are starting to do it as part of their normal development cycle. For example, Edge API is beginning to suss out and work on theirs, if you've been aware of that project at all. So with that all being said, James, are you all set to go?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing. James, you can grab it.
All right, cool. Well, nice to meet everybody for those that I haven't met before. And as Josh said, we've been working pretty hard on a OneRoster reference implementation. Josh and I have put a lot of time and thought into this, and there's a bunch of tools that are available. So I'm kind of I don't have much time, so I'm gonna go through it kind of quick. But as usual, if you have more detailed questions that this time doesn't permit for, just reach out to us and we're happy to show you more. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And the first thing that I should say here is not only is the deployed version of the reference implementation available to members, but also the source code is. So everything that you're gonna see today in this session is actually available to you in the raw code format too. And this holds true with the LTI reference implementation as well. So if you're ever interested in how we implemented something, or maybe some libraries or whatever that we're using to make it more useful, reach out and you can get access to the code too. So the LTI reference implementation, it is built in Ruby, and the OneRoster reference implementation is actually built in Elixir, which is very similar to Ruby. So both Elixir and Ruby are very easy to understand syntax-wise if you have used any other programming language. Java, PHP, Python, these Ruby and Elixir were all kind of inspired to some degree from those languages. So as you come in here, it's very easy to read. It's all MVP type stuff. So I'm going to post a link here in the chat to the source code. And if you don't have access to it, just reach out and we can give access to that. But it's all there. And importantly, if you decide to use this reference implementation and you find a bug, which happens, we accept pull requests and we also accept issues. So if you just file an issue, then that lets us know that, hey, you found something, and we'll be more than happy to look into it. So with that, the OneRoster reference implementation is available at this URL, which I'll also post in the chat. You do have to be logged in, but we have single sign-on with the IMS Global website. So if you have a login there, it also works here. I'm already logged in. So as Josh mentioned, there's a lot of OneRoster resources available to members, and we've done our best to provide the links here on the landing page so that it's easily accessed there too. So this is a OneRoster 1.1 reference implementation. We've started work on 1.2, but that's not released. A couple things to note here. If you do end up using this, release notes is a good place to check out what's new. So if something was working yesterday and it's not working today, maybe we fixed something or found a bug, we'll try to keep the release notes up to date. And then coming soon is something that Josh and I kind of manage together. So of course, we don't have the complete support for 1.1. You know, there's a few lingering items that we still have to do. But we try to keep that here in the coming soon. That way, if you don't see something, you know what to expect. So when you come here, the really cool thing about this reference implementation is you don't really have to do any setup. You will log in, we will create a team for you, and we will also create an entire OneRoster data set for you. So there's no exhaustive setup. There's not much you have to do in order to get started. And you know, within that first couple seconds, you actually have a OneRoster consumer and provider at your fingertips. So we offer 2 tools, and I'll switch my screen sharing in a second and show you the other side. But the first one is this UI. So this is more from the provider side. So if you're not really familiar with OneRoster, or you just want to learn a little bit more, kind of see what data is there, this UI is very, very helpful. And we actually put examples of the API calls here in the UI also. So this is real data. It's the data from above, so everything matches. And if you actually make a change to the data above here, it's going to reflect down here so that you can see what data you're admitting via your API. So here's the get all orgs, for example, and here's just the single organization API call with the ID. So everything in OneRoster is in here. So academic sessions, users, which we can come down here and see that API call as well. You're allowed to add new users. So if in your QA environment, or you know, in your dev environment or your local environment, you have very specific attributes, like you want to use a series of source IDs, or you know, an org name or something along those lines, you can feel free to change this. And this data here is protected, so it's not public. So when you log in, we actually create all of this under your account. So you don't have to worry about other people changing your data, and you can change it at will, and nobody else is going to be affected. We do have a Teams feature, so if you know, you have a couple people on your team that would access to this data set, you can add them to your team, and they also then have access to the data that was generated for you. Josh, I'm going to switch my screen to Postman real quick so we can see more of the consumer side. So Postman is a tool, if you're not familiar with it, that is pretty awesome. It allows you to do many things, but amongst one thing that's awesome is you can create APIs in here, create calls, add authentication. You can create a collection and then export that so other people can use it too. So we, on the OneRoster reference implementation landing page, we have a link to a Postman collection of the entire OneRoster set of APIs that are by default hooked up to the OneRoster reference implementation. If you're not too familiar with Postman, you do have to do a little bit of tweaking with settings. So like when your team gets generated, you're going to have a different OAuth key and secret than I have set up by default. So you may have to change that, but if you have questions about how to do that, feel free to reach out. Josh and I have done that quite a bit. So like I said, from the consumer side, all of the APIs in OneRoster 1.1 are actually implemented here in Postman. So you can see there are just dozens of them. And the Colin's on the call. I don't know the exact number of REST API calls in OneRoster 1.1, but there's a lot. But with any of these, you can actually call out to the OneRoster reference implementation, and this is a real OAuth call. And this is real data coming back from the OneRoster reference implementation. So this is my team, and this is all the data that you would expect. So even if you're like, well, the OneRoster reference implementation is nice, but I don't really need it, I would highly recommend downloading this Postman collection, because it's good for a couple of things. One, you can just see exactly how it works, what authentication it's using, what data is returned, the structure of it. But we've also made almost everything that you would want configurable a dynamic variable. So for example, if you have a different provider that you would like to connect this to and test with, you can just change this variable to their URL. You can change the key and secret to the key and secret they shared with you, and you can actually make these exact same calls somewhere else. Josh, do you think there's anything else I should say about Postman while we're here? Because I know it does require, it's slightly complex, but.
Do you want to just really quickly walk them through how they would update those environment variables? That's something that people run into.
Yeah, sure. So Postman has concepts of environments. So here I have OneRoster reference implementation, and this is it goes to my local machine, and then I have a OneRoster reference implementation prod that goes to the actual deployed version. But if you look at it in a little bit more detail, you can see here that there's a bunch of dynamic variables, and the way that you change that is come down to here. So right now, this OneRoster REST APIs 1.1 folder kind of contains like a parent setting for authentication. So if you want to change your consumer key and secret, you can do that here. You can also apply a whole bunch of other attributes, including some custom config. So it's worth playing around with, but we didn't want to repeat this, countless times. So it was kind of easy to set up here. And as far as the variables themselves, you just come up here to this little drop down. The collection that you import will have this by default. You can edit that, and they recently just changed this. Well, Josh, we may need to update the instructions. I don't remember how to change this with the new thing. Oh, here we go. Yeah, hit the edit button. That's pretty obvious. So here is all of the variables that are not related to authentication. So if you want to change the org ID to your org ID, what you would get in the OneRoster reference implementation UI, you would just change all of these there. By default, it's set up to a default data set, so you don't have to do this to get started. But if you generate your own team and data set, and you want to test with that specifically to be sure that nobody changes anything, you're gonna want to spend 5 or 6 minutes here just replacing these variables with the ones the UI gives you. All right, so with that,
Before you move on, question in the chat about security and authentication. The question was what security protocol you're using, if it's OAuth 1, OAuth 2.
So right now the Postman collection is set up for OAuth 1, but we actually do have OAuth 2 support. I haven't tested that with Postman yet, but it's there. And if you play around with it and you discover that OAuth 2 works, please let us know. I just haven't had time to fully test it yet. So, but Postman does allow you to do OAuth 2, which is awesome. I believe in the next version of OneRoster, it's OAuth 2 by default, right, Josh?
Well, right now for OneRoster 1.2, We're accepting both, but OAuth
Okay.
1.0 support is slated to be ending. Colin, correct me if I'm wrong. End of this year.
Okay.
In the 1.1, that's right. In 1.2, it's only OF2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, James.
So as we're kind of working 1.2 into this, we'll update the collection to support OAuth 2 also. That way you can switch back and forth. And my plans are right now to actually upgrade this to 1.2 and allow you to choose whether you want 1.1 or 1.2. A lot of the data is the same. So Colin and Josh and that work group did awesome there. There's a lot of new data, but a lot of the data that was in 1.1 is still the same. So it's kind of just a slight lift to do 1.2.
Yeah, I would just interject there that later today or maybe tomorrow there will be an email that goes out to everyone about recordings to other sessions that happened during this. And I did a presentation Tuesday, I believe, on the differences between OneRoster 1.1 and 1.2. I see some familiar names. Some of you were a part of that session. But if you're curious, if you weren't a part of that session and you are curious what the differences are between the two, there's a session where we walk through them, sort of in detail from all of the different services. So be on the lookout for that link.
Yeah, perfect. That's a good point. It was a good presentation too. So the next feature that I'm going to show you, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so I'm just kind of going to show this for about a minute, is this idea of an ecosystem. So if you work with any of the IMS standards, you know that there is a lot of abilities for them to work together really, really well. Like OneRoster and LTI, for example, go together really nicely. But also Caliper, Case, all the specs have the opportunity to be in an ecosystem where they all help achieve the same goals. So we've actually kind of taken a next step in to start to show people how things can work together. So right now, what we have is an SIS, which or a provider, and this is sort of what the provider in the OneRoster reference implementation is sort of simulating. We are working on the ability to show how this actually works if you just have a single sign-on portal. So maybe you're using SAML or some other single sign-on, and you're unconfident how that can work with the standards. We want to show you that. This is a live ecosystem, so I can resync here, and it's going to try to reach out to the provider and grab the data and sync itself. We can see here that it's going to provide you some really useful feedback. So in this case, it was able to sync the academic sessions, but courses, users, and results weren't able to be synced. So this reference implementation is kind of unique in the sense that it's actually tied into the LTI reference implementation. So one of the common complaints that we got with the LTI reference implementation, even though hundreds of people used it, was that it's a little bit hard to set up because you have to set up a tool, a platform, and if you don't get something right, then you end up spending a little bit of time troubleshooting that, and that can be hard to do. So we're actually integrating that, and you can see down here in the bottom left, there's the LTI reference implementation tools and platforms. So when you set up one of these ecosystems, it's actually going to set up an entire LTI reference implementation environment for you. So you don't actually have to go over there and set things up. This ecosystem will do that for you, which means that you can start to see OneRoster working and LTI working in a matter of minutes, which is really awesome. So this tool is going to show how the data flows from an SIS to a provider, how a single sign-on portal that's not part of these IMS standards might work into that, and you'll actually see how that data affects the platform and the learning tool. So I won't talk too much about this because we only have 4 minutes left, But if you have more questions or you want to know more about this, please reach out to us, because I'm personally really excited about this feature. And we have plans to work in Caliper and other standards into this ecosystem too, so that you can see a more holistic picture of all the work that IMS does and how it can be used together. So let me stop there and see if anybody has questions. Or if you have any general feedback, we'd love to hear it. If you think this is going to be really useful, or any ideas, we're all ears.
I think everybody's just amazed by what you've done.
That, or their coffee machines aren't quite quite operating yet.
Yeah, I overslept a little, so I've got 2 Dunkin' Donuts coffees on my table instead of my normal just giant coffee cup. Okay, yeah. If you have any access issues, shoot me an email and I'll investigate and try to get them resolved.
So Kevin, we are not using a particular SIS. We're kind of doing a MVP version of what a bare minimum SIS would look like, just for our uses. Stephen, when is this going to be available for affiliate members? I believe that this is actually available for affiliate members now. So if you don't have access, just reach out to somebody IMS and ask. And Lance, same thing. If you reach out to us, we can see about getting you access to the repo.
There again is my email address. You can use me as the point of contact and I'll get the information that you need.
Well, I guess since we have a minute, I'll show you something else. So this is kind of an important feature that I talked about, where you could actually go to the other version here.
While you're doing that, Kevin asked how many, when the initial data is set up, when you get registered, how many students and schools get set up in there?
That's a great question. I think there is 3 or 4 schools and maybe 30 or 40 students. If you would like a lot more data in there, we have the auto generator built already, and there's no reason that couldn't be configurable. So if, because that's a great point, because I've thought too, like, well, it's great to see 30 users, but that's not really how real life works. There's typically, maybe hundreds or thousands in there. So if you are interested in having a much larger data set, let's talk about that, because it's technically very easy to do. 30 users is just an arbitrary number that we picked, but there's no reason why that couldn't be 300. So teams real quick. So here you can see all the various teams that you're part of. I happen to be part of 2. There is a team token here. If you go through the login flow and somebody wants to join your team, they're going to be asked for your team's token. I just wanted to call this out, that you would find it on the teams page, and you could just Slack this or email it to somebody and they can use that to join your team. So Josh, I think unless we have 30 more minutes, I think that's about as far as I can go.
Yeah, that does bring us to the bottom of the hour. Because can you mind if you stop sharing real quick? I want to grab. So because I did not present early on, I just want to come back to this so that it's in the recording. A couple of resources that are available. The OneRoster main page, which gives you links to specification, implementation guide, conformance guide, etc. The testing page where you can go to test and certify for 1.1 or 1.2. The IMS support page where if you have a technical issue with any of the tools that we have, you can go and raise a ticket or read some FAQs. Both the public and private forum. And the SLDM data and mapping and discovery tools, which allow you to peruse or investigate this set of IMS standards. And then lastly, if you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me at jmcgee@imsglobal.org. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, James, for giving a presentation here, and I hope everyone found this useful. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Josh, James.